In this lesson, we're going to cover topic 2.2, also known as functions. We're going to first cover how functions work, then we're going to cover the range and domain, then we'll look over the 4 types of relations, then also we'll go over inverse functions, how they work and how to get them, and then I will give you a small tip for tests and exams as well regarding functions. So when you're dealing with functions and domain and range, you kind of have to imagine functions as a grinder. So most of you know how grinders work. You just put something in and something else comes out. So in this case, what comes in are the x values. So let's get 3 x values. Let's get this, and let me use another color. So in this grinder, in go all the x values, meaning that they go in, and inside you have like a function. Well, let's go to a simple function that you know, like y is equal to 2x. And then you clearly have to understand that out of this come the same x values that y. So if here is x1, then comes out y1, and comes out y2, and this was like y3. So this is actually quite simple. You have to understand this, and we can also use a real life example as well. So let's, for instance, take a color and say that we choose an x value to be 3, and it goes in the function grinder, as we can say, and we can see that y is equal to 2x. Then we do y is 2 times 3 and y is 6, and then we can get that y is equal to 6. This actually makes very much sense, and I hope this is a great way to understand actually how functions work. So range and domain are something also very important that you have to know. So if you have a function, for instance, let's take something like this, and can I get a shape? And you have a line that goes something like this. Well, it's very easy to understand what range and domain are. You have to understand that range is all y values. So in this case, you have to look. So you right now should understand that the vertical is always the y values, and the horizontal is the x values. So if range means all the y values, then you have to check out your function, and then you have to like map out all the places where y value exists. And if here, let's say the y value of this is 6 and the y value of this is -2, this is just a random example, then you can get that the y values of these are -2 to 6. And you get these answers, and then you can get that your range, also known as all possible y values, are -2 to 6. And now you might be wondering, what is domain? Domain is actually quite simple as well. It's just all possible x values. And then you can also map it out as something like this, that you just understand all the values where x is like on your graph. And here you can see that, let's also take that this is -4, and here it is 12. Then you can also, these are also just random examples, and then you can also write down your domain as -4 to 12. And always, they have to be always closed brackets when you're dealing with the points that are actually passed. And sometimes in sometimes in sometimes in test exercises and also in exam questions, they are made like the range and domain are limited, and it's said in the question that the domain of this is the domain is 7 to 12. This is just random numbers again, and then you have to find the range of this, and then you can just take your domain's last points 7 and put it to the function, and also 12 and put it to the function, and then you get the range, which is also known as the y-values. So in functions there are 4 types of relations as well. The first one is the first one is one-to-many. 1-to-1. The first one is 1-to-1. And what this means is, let me draw another function over here. That if you have a function and you have your function over here, then 1-to-1 means that there is one x value that corresponds to one y value. Then you also have one-to-many. One-to-many. And this is where you also have a function. However, let me draw another graph for you. This is also when you have a function, and one-to-many means that you have one x value and it corresponds to different y values. For example, some can go like this, and then you can clearly see that you have one x. However, it goes to different y values. Then you also have many-to-one, which you kind of have to understand. It's just if you have many x values, like this can be something like this even, that you have many x values and they correspond to one y value as well. And also many-to-many, but I will not go as much depth into this, as this is something like if you have a circle, for instance, and I don't want to draw this right now. So inverse functions are very important in your papers as well, as I think at least every paper 1 or paper 2 every year contains this, so this is something very important. So inverse functions, you have to kind of think out like this. When you have, let's draw a function that it's something like this, and you draw your function. Oh no, that doesn't look good. And you draw your function and it looks something like this, and you can see that it has, let's take a random point over here where x is 7 and the y value is 5. And you kind of have to understand that, let's say you have the points 7 and 5 of your function, then inverse function is when you flip these. Why is the mouse not working? When you flip these. So therefore it would be 5 and 7. And this essentially means that you switch out the y values switched with x values. And giving it like a better understanding. And you have to also understand that the inverse functions are usually given the citation of f minus 1. This is an inverse function. And how to get an inverse function is also very commonly asked, because many paper exams and also tests ask you to get this. So let's try to do this. So if you're, oh my god, so if your fx is something like 2x plus 7, and then you want to find f minus 1x, which is also known as inverse x, then what you have to do is you switch all x's and all y's. So you want to find this. Then you know that your original, like this, is the same as y is equal to 2x plus 7. And if you want to get an inverse of this, then you will simply make it into x is equal to 2y plus 7. And now most of you have learned basic algebra. Now you want to get the y to the other side and the x to that side. So you continue and get that if you move the stuff around, you get that minus 2y is equal to minus x plus 7. And then you can divide everything by minus 2. And you get that y is equal to 0.5x minus 3.5. And that's your inverse function right there. You always want to puzzle out that when you switch the y and x in your function, and then you want to get again that y is equal to something like we have over here, and that is your inverse function. And you always have to know that if you have an inverse function and you have like let's say your range of the normal function is equal to the domain of the inverse function, f minus 1x. Exactly. And this is because I already talked before that you switch the y values. Yeah, so as I talked like before, if you had coordinates which were 7 and 5, and you know that this is the x value, this is the y value, and you know that the range are all y values, and domain is usually all x values. However, if you switch them, then y becomes the x value. As I talked before, you have to to understand the inverse function, you just switch each coordinate. So therefore you understand that the y becomes, so the f inverse would be 5 and 7, and then you understand that the y goes into the x place, therefore the x is the y of the normal. So let me go there again. Y is 5 in this case. However, if you have an inverse function, it turns x, and domain is all the x values. So therefore you can say always that range of a function is equal to the domain of the inverse function. And to top it all off, I also have a small tip for your tests and exams. It's to basically, it's a very simple phrase. It's to write out everything in words. So in many cases you have real life problems, and it may actually be quite difficult to understand the problem. However, my number one tip for everyone during tests and exams would just to write out everything in words, to actually understand the real life context, because you sometimes make mistakes when you just write out numbers and you don't realize that there is some tweak in the context given. And then I always suggest to write out everything in words, then you actually understand the real life context behind everything. And that's it for today, and thank you.